Okay, hi there, welcome back. So step one of cutting and prepping your fabric to cover your hat. We chose fabric for the hat that is a medium weight sort of upholstery. You can see it here. Something that you would possibly make curtains out of or cover a pillow out of that is stable. You don't want it to be stretchy. You don't want it to be slippery. But also not heavy at the same time. So not too thin, not too heavy, something that's not going to slip away from you and that is going to do what you want to do. So crisp, smooth fabric is best for something like this. So you can see that I'm putting my pattern and marking it on the wrong side of the fabric. And I'm laying it out according to my pattern. So do go back and pay attention to where your grain line is on your pattern. Your grain line is that line with the arrows on either end. And then you want to make sure that you find the selvage edge of your fabric and that you line it up with the grain of the fabric. With the buckram, the grain didn't matter so much, but it definitely matters here with the fabric and how it will move and stretch and behave. So do pay attention to that. So this is the top of my crown. It already has seam allowance built into it, so I traced around the edges, and then I marked my halfway points and my center front and center back. And then you can see here that I went back and I marked where the sewing line would be. So the solid line here is the exterior line that I traced with the pattern. This is the interior sewing line, so that's where the buckram wired edge will match up to later, so that's important. Then here is my brim piece. If you remember before, we put seam allowance on the interior of the brim only, not on the exterior when we patterned it for the buckram. But here on the fabric, everything needs seam allowance. So go back and you can see here that I've got, this is the cutting line. I'm going to go back and mark a dotted exterior line. I didn't do that already, but I will. This is the exterior of the pattern or where the buckram will come to, and then I need seam allowance beyond that. So do be looking at your pattern where you put seam allowance and where you didn't, and make sure in the fabric seam allowance around all edges, interior and exterior. And then do go back and line up your center front, center back, and your side marks as well. On the side piece, on the side band piece, this is where it's most important for your grain to be really where you need it to be. And you can tell if I'm looking at the side band piece that's a rectangle like this, my grain line is on the bias. It's on a 45-degree angle. This is on purpose. Do not ignore this. And you can see when I've laid out my fabric completely that it, when these pieces are on grain, is running diagonally on the bias. So I've laid out that piece this way. The bias has a natural, very gentle stretch to it in these stable fabrics, and so that helps you smooth the side band piece around if it is on the bias. And again, with your side band piece, you've added seam allowance to the little ends here and here, so that you could match it up in the buckram, but we did not put seam allowance there because seam allowance on our other pieces took care of it in buckram. In fabric, I need seam allowance around all sides. So I've traced it and then I've gone back and I've added this dotted line. This is an extra ½ inch around these sides because I need seam allowance everywhere. So I'm going to cut one side band, one top of crown, one brim out of this fabric. And then I also need to think about my hat in 3 dimensions. So I've got a second fabric to be my lining, the underside of the hat and the interior part that touches your head. So I will repeat cutting all of these things out of the lining fabric. You could choose to cut everything out of the same fabric and everything be covered in the same fabric, which means you would cut 2 of every piece.